Some men are remembered for what they conquered. Some are remembered for what they survived. Fritz von Scholz is remembered for neither. He is remembered for the way he died, standing in the ruins of a city that had already fallen, refusing to leave his men, refusing to retreat, refusing to accept that the battle was over when every single fact on the ground told him it was. He was an SS general who fought on the Eastern Front for 3 years without flinching, who led his men through the most brutal battles of the entire war, and who in the end chose to die beside his soldiers rather than walk away from them. His name was Fritz von Scholz, and almost nobody today knows who he was. Fritz von Scholz was born on January 14, 1896, in Leitmeritz, a town in Bohemia that was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, into a military family that gave him both the discipline and the sense of duty that would define everything he did for the rest of his life. He was 18 years old when the First World War began in 1914, and like millions of young men across Europe, he was immediately swept into a conflict that would consume an entire generation. He served as an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army, fighting on multiple fronts and demonstrating the kind of personal courage and tactical ability that got young officers noticed and promoted in a war that was burning through its officer corps at a terrifying rate. He survived 4 years of war and came home in 1918 to find that the empire he had fought for had ceased to exist, dissolved by defeat into a collection of successor states that left men like Schultz without a country and without a clear identity. The interwar years were difficult for Schultz, as they were for so many veterans of the First World War who had given everything to a cause that had ended in collapse and humiliation. He drifted through the 1920s, trying to find his footing in a changed world, eventually settling in Germany and moving toward the nationalist movements that promised to restore the order and the pride that defeat had stripped away. By the 1930s, he had joined the SS and was building a new military career in an organization that was rapidly transforming itself from a political bodyguard unit into something far more serious, and he brought to it the same qualities he had demonstrated in the First World War: professional competence, personal courage, and a relationship with his men built on the understanding that a commander who asked his soldiers to die had an obligation to be willing to die alongside them. He rose steadily through the SS ranks during the 1930s, earning a reputation as a serious and capable officer who could be trusted with difficult assignments and who would not crack under pressure. When the Second World War began in 1939, he was already an experienced commander, and he fought through the early campaigns, building a combat record that marked him out as one of the more capable officers in the Waffen SS. But it was on the Eastern Front, in the vast and merciless war that Germany launched against the Soviet Union in June 1941, that Schultz truly came into his own, and where the full complexity and the full darkness of his story unfolded. The Eastern Front was not a war in any conventional sense. It was an ideological campaign of extermination, conducted on a scale that had no precedent in modern history. A war in which the German military operated under explicit orders that placed entire categories of human beings outside the protection of any law, and made their murder not a crime, but a policy. The Waffen SS formations that fought on the Eastern Front were part of a military machine that was simultaneously fighting a conventional war against the Red Army and participating in the systematic murder of Jewish communities, Soviet prisoners of war, and civilian populations across occupied territory. Fritz von Scholz commanded SS formations in this environment, and the units under his command were involved in atrocities that were not aberrations, but were built into the logic of the war the Germans were fighting in the East. That context cannot be separated from any honest account of who he was or what he did. Within that context, Schultz commanded the SS Infantry Regiment, 9, and later the 4th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nederland, leading his men through the grinding, attritional warfare of the Eastern Front with the same professional thoroughness he brought to everything. He fought in the battles around Leningrad, in the brutal winter campaigns of 1941 and 1942, where the cold killed as many men as the fighting did, and through the seesaw battles of 1943 and 1944, as the tide of the war turned irreversibly against Germany, and the question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how long it would take, and how many people would die before it was over. He was awarded the Knight's Cross and its higher grades, the decorations that the German military gave to officers who demonstrated exceptional combat performance, which in the context of the Eastern Front meant the ability to hold positions and conduct operations in conditions that regularly broke less experienced and less disciplined formations. By the summer of 1944, Schultz was in command of the 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, one of the more unusual formations in the entire Waffen SS, a division composed largely of volunteers from the Scandinavian countries, Danes and Norwegians who had come to fight on the Eastern Front in the belief that they were participating in a crusade against Bolshevism. The men he commanded had come from countries that Germany had occupied, men who had made a choice that would mark them as traitors in their home countries, regardless of how the war ended, and Schultz led them through the final desperate campaigns of the war on the Eastern Front, with the same commitment he had shown throughout his career. The end came at Narva in Estonia in the summer of 1944. The city of Narva had been the site of months of brutal fighting, as German forces tried to hold the line against Soviet pressure that was building inexorably as the Red Army's strength grew and Germany's diminished. By July 1944, the situation was becoming untenable. Soviet forces were pressing hard, the German lines were buckling, and the question of whether Narva could be held was becoming impossible to answer in the affirmative. The order came to withdraw, to abandon the city that had been fought over for so long and pull back to more defensible positions. Fritz von Scholz refused to leave until his men were out. He stayed at his command post in the city as the withdrawal proceeded around him, refusing the personal safety that his rank entitled him to claim, insisting that his place was with his soldiers until the last of them had pulled back. On July 28, 1944, while still in the city directing the withdrawal of his division, he was hit by Soviet artillery fire and mortally wounded. He died the same day, not in the way that generals usually die, in headquarters far behind the front lines, but in the city he had been ordered to abandon, among the men he had refused to leave behind. He was 48 years old. He had spent 30 years in uniform across 2 world wars. He had fought for empires and ideologies that history has judged harshly, and the formations he commanded had participated in crimes that cannot be minimized or explained away. But in the end, he died the way he had lived, as a soldier, with his men, in the place where the fighting was, refusing to take the easy way out when the hard way was what duty demanded. The men of the Nordland Division did not forget him. The Scandinavian volunteers who had followed him to the Eastern Front and who survived the war carried his memory with them back to countries that wanted nothing to do with what they had done or the men they had followed. History has not been kind to Fritz von Scholz, which is appropriate given the regime he served and the war he fought in. But history has also recorded that he was the kind of commander who stayed when he could have left, who died when he could have survived, and who in the end asked nothing of his men that he was not prepared to give himself. That is his story. And now you know it.